Hello and welcome to Tim's BMW Repairs and Information. Well, this is a bit of an unusual one today. We're not working on the 6 Series or the 8 Series. No, this is all about social conscience. And isn't it time these old dinosaur cars were cold? And shouldn't I be driving an electric car instead? I mean, we're environmentally conscious here. We've got a whole bunch of solar panels on the roof, compost everything, we recycle everything. We've even got an allotment to grow our vegetables. So isn't it an anathema to be driving huge, great, belching V8s at the end of 2021? Isn't it time for a brand new electric car? I mean, this car bungs out 281 grams of CO2 per kilometre. 8 Series, probably about 300 per kilometre, because it's less efficient. That 281 grams per kilometre stated by BMW for the 650i is calculated from the MPG, but of course MPG as stated by BMW is probably different to what you're doing. All depends on how you drive the car. Now the 281 grams is calculated from 24 miles per gallon extra urban, so that's the average of city driving and motorway driving. But of course you can check your own MPG, and I'm on 22.6, so I'm banging out probably closer to 300 grams per kilometre. I'm banging out all that CO2 into the atmosphere. Well, it just is absolutely dead obvious, isn't it? Cull the old dinosaurs, get an electric car. But it's much better to keep hold of these old dinosaurs and keep them going. It's better for the planet, it's better for the environment. Let's go for a drive and I'll try and explain what I mean. Well, before we start, I think it's very important to mark the goalposts, because it makes a huge difference to the mathematics used to calculate which car is better for the environment. First of all, the first data point is that I only drive 5,000 miles a year in this car. Now, the amount of miles that I drive in this car is very relevant to where the crossover point comes between CO2 emissions from an EV and an old V8 dinosaur. So that's the first thing, 5,000 miles a year. Second thing is that this car is 13 years old, 840 is 23 years old. They've paid their debt to society as well. The CO2 emitted during their manufacture, been and gone, blowing in the wind a long time ago. Whereas I'm comparing against a brand new electric car, which puts on average about 20 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere during its production. Now, that may seem rather unfair as a starting criteria, but it's my decision whether to carry on driving this car, in which case we start with a value of 0 CO2 emissions, or do I buy a brand new EV, which starts off with 20 tonnes of CO2 emissions. So that's the type criteria I'm using. Now, what we could do, of course, is buy a second-hand EV, in which case then we both start at 0. But the criteria for this video is buying a new EV against keeping an old V8. Now, it's something the government's pushing pretty hard with all sorts of tax incentives at the moment. Get rid of your dinosaur, buy a brand new EV. In fact, it's 100% relief for companies if they get rid of their gas guzzling cars and buy EVs. Then it doesn't cost the company anything. It comes straight off the bottom line. So it's essentially free to companies. Now, the government's pushing something that I believe doesn't actually bear close scrutiny, because if we're getting rid of a 13-year-old car and buying a brand new one, then that comes with its 20 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere before it turns a wheel. So anyway, fair or not, that's the criteria we're using. It's a decision for me personally whether I keep this old V8 dinosaur or buy a brand new EV. So that's our starting points, and that's the data I'm going to use throughout the video. First of all, it's nice to be in the 6 Series. I really do like driving the 650. It's such a malleable, powerful car, very visceral, bit animal in its power if you're not careful with it, but it's a beautiful car to drive. And I'd miss it if I bought an electric car, but I don't have to. Well, I've already told you that it's more environmentally friendly to keep on driving these ancient dinosaurs, but now I've got to prove it. We're now in a position that we know that my 650i puts around about 450 grams per mile into the atmosphere, or 281 grams per kilometre. What does an electric vehicle put into the atmosphere per mile or per kilometre? Well, the answer to that is obviously zero. It's got zero tailpipe emissions. Hasn't even got a tailpipe, so it must be zero. But unfortunately, you've got to actually produce the electricity that's used to recharge the battery. Yeah, but we're not really sure how much that costs the environment. Well, we do actually, because governments by law have to publish the figure of what it costs the environment per kilowatt hour of electricity they actually produce. And that's what this shows. United Kingdom's down the bottom, very similar to United States, because we use a mix of technologies to produce electricity. We use coal-fired, gas-fired, renewable, solar, wind, geothermal, hydro and stuff like that. But the mix gives us a value of 347 grams per kilowatt hour. As I say, very similar to the United States, use similar mixes to produce the electricity. Now, in the United States, there are differences between different states, and that information's also published. So there we go, that's a good start. But of course, if you lived in Switzerland, which is the next line up, it's 18 grams per kilowatt hour. It's absolutely tiny. But unfortunately, if you live in Serbia or Poland, you've got 810 grams of CO2 going into the atmosphere for a kilowatt hour. Okay, so at least now we know how much CO2 is put into the environment. Well, you have to also add a little factor because, of course, 347 grams into the atmosphere to produce a kilowatt hour is at the generating station. From the generating station, it's got to go through pylons. It's got to be reduced to 11,000 volts at a big transformer. They're lossy. Down 11,000 volt cables to your local substation and then transformed to 110 or 240 volts. All of that is lossy. And what we're going to do is we're going to err on the side of a caution again and say that it's 400 grams per kilowatt hour by the time it gets to the wall socket to plug it into your car. Okay, so that's good. We now have got a figure of 400 grams per kilowatt hour. Yep, that's a fat lot of good. What we need to know next is how far does an EV go for a kilowatt hour? And fortunately, that sort of information is available. And we've got it here. The most economical is 24 kilowatt hours per 100 miles, which works out more or less about 4 miles per kilowatt hour, which isn't too bad. Unfortunately, that's the very top of the table. And of course, as we go further down the table, things get pretty horrible with 54 kilowatt hours per 100 miles, so less than 2 miles for a kilowatt hour. Again, we're going to err on the side of caution and say it's going to be 4 miles per kilowatt hour, which is good for mathematics because that makes it 100 grams of CO2 into the atmosphere per mile. And then you can say you can easily compare that against the 650i, which is 450 grams per mile versus 100 grams per mile on the EV. And you say, well, the EV's won again. Unfortunately, there's always costs in manufacturing, and it is rather unfortunate that it takes quite a lot of CO2 to produce a battery. And there's been so many studies on this, and here's just a quick list of a few of the studies, and some of them go as low as 56 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So what they're doing is they're saying it takes this much carbon to produce this much kilowatt hours in a battery pack. Yet from 56 up to 494. which it makes it very difficult to do any calculations. But we've got two things going for us. First of all, they have got an average, which is 110 kilograms of CO2 into to produce a kilowatt hour of battery power. Now, of course, the battery capacity ranges from 100 kilowatt hours down to about 40 kilowatt hours. Yeah, I'm not quite sure who's got 30 kilowatt hour battery, but that's going to be a tiddler, probably a milk float. Righty-ho, so 110 kilograms of CO2 into the atmosphere per kilowatt hour. That's good information. Fortunately, although it's all rather confusing, Polestar want to be absolutely transparent about what the cost to the environment is to produce one of their electric cars, and in this case it's the Polestar 2. So here we go. At last we got some real world figures regarding the cost to the environment to build an electric car, and in this case the Polestar 2. Okay, so here's an ICE here, which is the XC40, which is an internal combustion engine car, and the manufacturing of materials works out to be about 17 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere. Now for the Polestar 2, we've got the battery as well, and that brings it all up to 26 tonnes of CO2. That is a huge cost to the environment. And the other important thing is the battery itself. During its manufacture, 6 tonnes of CO2 is put into the atmosphere to produce it. And just to make matters worse, of course, the lithium-ion battery packs have a finite life. They last about 10 years and then they become so inefficient that it's time to replace them. And there we go, another 6 tonnes into the atmosphere of CO2 in year 10. Okie dokes, so at last we've got some real world figures we can use. We've got the cost per mile for the V8, for the 650i, and we've got the cost per mile in CO2 for the average EV. And of course we're comparing a brand new EV versus my ancient BMW 650i. So we start with a sort of zero emissions at this point in year 0. It's a second-hand car, and the question is it better to keep an old V8 running versus buying a brand new electric car? So we start off with a value of 0, and we've erred on the side of caution again to say it's going to be 20 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere to produce that brand new electric car. So yeah, instead of 26 tonnes, we're going for 20 tonnes just to make things a bit fairer. And as you can see, right along the bottom is the mileage, and I'm doing 5,000 miles per year. So when we get to year 9, we're getting close to parity up here, not far off. But of course, year 10, you need a new battery, and the EVs then put more CO2 into the environment than the 650i. We reach parity in year 14 at 70,000 miles. So yeah, that's quite a distance and quite a time. So I'm quite happy to keep driving my 650i at the moment. But what if I did 10,000 miles a year? Well, it gets worse for the internal combustion engine car. We cross over at about year 5.5 or something over here at 10,000 miles a year. And if we're doing 30,000 miles a year, we reach year 2, and yeah, the EV is much better for the environment. So there we go then. In my situation, and that's what this video is all about, is it better to drive an ancient 650i, or is it better to drive an EV if you're just doing 5,000 miles a year? And the answer is, for 14 years, it's much better to drive the 650i. It's kinder to the environment, kinder to the planet as a whole. If I did more miles, then it becomes a lot less desirable. And if I was doing 30,000 miles a year in my 650, then yeah, I'm doing something very wrong, and I'm producing much too much emissions in respect to an EV car, and it'd be much better to have an EV. But I don't. I mean, that's the point. The next question is it better to buy a brand new frugal car like the BMW 118, which bungs out 147 grams per mile? in respect to the 100 grams per mile that the EV puts out. Well, it seems, again, a simple answer that the EV is going to be better, but it isn't. And that's because the manufacturing of the battery always means that you're going to put an extra 5 tonnes into the atmosphere every time you buy a brand new EV. So I'm afraid we start off with 15 tonnes into the environment to build a 118i, and that's been very generous. I think the real world values are a lot less than that, whereas we know the EV from the information that people publish is going to be about 20 tonnes. We almost reached parity in year 9. Of course, in year 10 you need a new battery. So no, it's much better for the environment to keep driving a 118i if you're doing 5,000 miles a year. 10,000 miles a year, again, it's the same. Year 10 needs a new battery, don't quite make it. Probably ends up with about year 20, 25, something like that you reach parity. 30,000 miles a year, you can drive 90,000 miles or for 4 or 3 years and you're better off than the EV. Get past that and the EV is going to win time after time. Right, there we go then, home again. Yeah, I'm a lot happy about driving my ancient old 650 for the next 14 years until I reach parity with an EV. Now, the information that I used for this video took a lot of investigation, mainly because the EV manufacturers don't publish the information about the cost of the environment of manufacturing the car, and they generally state their output on countries which have a reasonable generation of power with renewables. So it's usually skewed that way. Fortunately, Polestar do publish information, and yeah, it's quite shocking really, wasn't it? 27 tonnes of CO2 into the environment just for the manufacture of the car. And that sort of gives the internal combustion engine quite a bit of a head start in relation to an EV. Now, the Polestar is a mid-size SUV, so we can err on the side of caution and say it's 20 tonnes into the atmosphere for your average EV. The other shocking bit of information, of course, was the cost of the environment of building a lithium-ion battery pack. 6 to 7 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere for the Polestar 2. Yet it's going to take a long time for the EV to reach parity with an internal combustion car with that output into the environment. So that's got to change. The important thing is the manufacture of lithium-ion batteries got to change so that the cost to the environment is much lower. Maybe just a couple or 3 tonnes or something will make things a lot easier. The other problem, of course, is that EV battery packs have a finite life. After about 10 years, they become so inefficient, you have to change them. And with the Polestar's battery, of course, that's another 7 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere. So you just about reach parity with an IC, and then up you go again. And you never reach parity at certain driving styles. So, yeah, the battery packs have got to last longer. They've got to be manufactured in a way that puts less CO2 into the atmosphere. And then the generation of electricity, of course, is highly important. Driving an EV in Poland is worse for the environment, forgetting all the manufacturing costs to the environment, nullifying both the IC and the EV. It's much better to drive a BMW 118i because it puts less carbon into the atmosphere. 118 puts 147 grams. If you're driving an EV in Poland, you're putting something like 200 grams per kilometre. So the 118 is always going to be better for the environment in places like Poland, Serbia, India, some places in China as well. So in places that produce electricity, such as Greenland and Switzerland, hydro and geothermal, which doesn't cost anything in CO2 to the environment, then it's obviously much better for the environment to drive an EV, especially if you're doing a lot of miles, because you then quickly nullify the cost of the environment of the production of the car in the first place. and also the excess CO2 put into the atmosphere when the battery needs replacing. So yeah, if those two things can be done, lower the output of CO2 into the atmosphere for the manufacture of batteries and generate the electricity by renewables, geothermals and all sorts of renewables, wind power, solar, then the internal combustion engine car just doesn't have a chance against it. But in my situation, and using all the data I've gleaned, and I've gone into quite a bit of depth going through all the information to make sure I'm not making any mistakes. Yeah, in my situation, it's much better to keep hold of this old dinosaur for at least 14 years at 5,000 miles per year. So I don't feel so guilty about it now. Now, I'm going to get hundreds of comments about this. I'm absolutely sure to, and I'm quite happy, very happy to get comments. If you want to point out something I've got wrong, that's fine. And I'm quite happy to do another video to save, you know, the mistakes I made. But I'm pretty sure I've got everything right, and that all the figures are real world figures and not the ones put in by the government or by car manufacturers who sort of weasel away from the real truth of the cost to the environment in CO2 of producing EVs. So if you like this video, stick your thumbs up and keep subscribing, keep commenting, and I'll see you next time.